The acoustic in here needs a bit of adjusting. We need to make sure that we speak right into the microphones, folks, and then you need to tell us if you can't hear.
Yeah.
How's that? Can you hear now? Can you hear me? So the images, and this is Darren, and halfway through, he's going to be taken over by Helen, who is signing. And all the way through the festival, in fact. Thank you for all the things that you're doing to make it accessible, along with the speech text. Quick plug, if anybody wants to learn how to be a speech texter, that would be very helpful, because it would be our ambition to make sure that all our work here, in the not too distant future, all our work is something which people can access in whatever way they can. So in January, we created our first Being a Man festival, and I think we're going to just flick some images for you. That was actually Malala's father, Zayuddin Yousafzai, with Jon Snow. Just keep flicking through. There he is. Anyway, proving that we can do two things at the same time, You can't hear? Okay, so we decided to do a Being a Man festival for the first time, for this reason, that it seemed to me, as somebody who is quite a personal thing really, a son and an ex-husband and a new partner, all of whom I realised had much less chance to actually be given permission to talk about the feelings of being a man. Whatever I might have felt and do feel about society being organised around power descending from men downwards, and therefore having to sort of struggle upwards to get equality, whatever I might feel about that, I had to recognise, and I do recognise, that men are also trapped within that same paradigm. And although that might be fortunate for many and feel comfortable for many, it definitely has its own boxes, its own constraints, and its own pitfalls. And it definitely, as well, in a world where women rightly are saying we want this landscape to change, and it will change, and we will make changes, it definitely produces a landscape that contains the notion of hostility, whether it's true or not. It contains argument and conflict. It, over and over again, not only does the media demonise women, but quite understandably, women are inclined to then demonise men. In other words, the lump called women has an alternative lump called men, from which many individual men feel that they have to defend themselves. They say, well, maybe them, but not me, etc. So I felt that actually, for a cultural centre like ourselves, which provides a safe space to talk about dangerous things, we really ought to say men are entitled and must have permission to talk through this stuff. I also feel that we learn this about any conflict situation. There comes a moment when people have to sit down together and talk. And usually that talk happens with some third party arbitrating. Now, there is no third party. There's no third sex. I mean, there's lots of definitions of sexuality, but there's no actual place, where a different thing can come in and go, I can hear both sides and this is how I'd like you to negotiate. So it's down to us. And I think that women have had space and continue to want space, sometimes women only, and sometimes in groups, where just listening and hearing what's going on is required. And I wanted to find out whether men felt they needed the same. And this festival kind of sold out with men and boys, over 16s and upwards. It sold out quicker than the first Women of the World Festival. And it was a festival that I put together with the great help of John McKeown and Akala and Tim Samuel and Shawnee and Anthony, and a lot of other men who said, well, these are the subject matters that I think that are urgent. So we wanted to feed back to this festival, really, what some of those issues were, and in order to consider, does something different happen empathetically when men hear from women? Not as in this is what you've done wrong, but this is what I am struggling with. And therefore, does something happen differently, empathetically, to women when they have that corresponding conversation with men? And is empathy and love the more powerful tool than logic and politics? Logic and politics follows, but does something else have to happen first? It's a question. And those of you who were with Malala this morning, the inspiration is not really coming from her going, I'm going to take up Article 77 and do this with it. That's a follow-up. But something else happens when you see her extraordinary sense of justice. And obviously Martin Luther King specifically talked about the fact that hate was too heavy a burden to bear, so he was going to deal in love. And we all love men. There can't be anybody here who doesn't love a man. And men love women, And so that's it, really. That was the conversation starter. So I'm going to turn to John McKeown. Well, actually, I think what I'll do, first of all, is just ask you all to introduce yourself with 1.5 sentences, which surely will be difficult for you. But
it's true.
but he's adopted me, so that's all right. But I'll start with you. Go on, I'll give you the test. 1.5 sentences.
Okay, well, first of all, happy International Women's Weekend, everybody. I asked a female friend of mine this morning what she was doing to celebrate International Women's Day. She said that she was baking a cake for her husband, and then she was going later on to get a manicure and talk with her friend to talk about the global hardships of women. And I think it was good that she's acknowledging International Women's Day in her own way, and I'm so privileged to be here. I specialise in young fatherhood. I'm a practitioner, and I help prepare young expectant men for their roles as fathers. Young men whose dads aren't actually around in their own lives, and they have no concept of what it means to be a dad.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name's Anthony, and I write poetry and teach poetry in schools to young people. And some of the things that I've learnt within that experience I've been managed to translate into these ideas that I'm going to hopefully share and speak today.
I'm Tim. I create and present Men's Hour on BBC Radio 5 Live, which is the young whippersnapper male counterpart to Woman's Hour. We lower the tone of Woman's Hour once a year in a joint programme. And I also make documentaries, halfway through one on immigration for BBC One, so I'll stop the sentence halfway through.
Thank you.
My name's Akala. I'm a hip-hop artist and historian and co-founder of the Hip Hop Shakespeare Company.
I am John McKeown. I'm a psychotherapist and addictions counsellor. I've worked in that world for over 25 years. I worked in men's prisons for 6 years. An element of that was spent with life sentence prisoners. I'm still involved with a few addiction charities, and I also have a practice here in London.
So, John, I'm going to start with you, if I may. One of the statistics in being a man was something we kind of know in our hinterland, but the most young male deaths are through suicide, and then followed on by boy-to-boy, man-to-man murder. Certainly violence between men is more extreme than violence to women, but goes unacknowledged in lots of ways. Also, 95% of our prison population are men. And most people struggling with addiction are men, although, of course, women are making a fast attempt to catch up. So can you just talk to me about in your practice, both one-to-one therapy and in the prisons and so on, what do you feel are the areas that men are struggling with that they feel unable to disclose or feel as if they shouldn't be struggling with them? What are the main areas that you think men are trying to deal with?
I want to come at this from another angle, really, and maybe talk about this permission that you've described and the permission that BAM created and this festival, of course, where people can listen to other people share about what they've been through. And that's obviously that's quite vague. But there's a whole reasons from, cultural backgrounds, class, single parents, both parents. You know, we listened to a whole thing on gang culture, and that whole thing of where do I fit in? You know, where do I get my identity from? And I think a lot of boys, particularly and young men, are looking to kind of belong. I mean, if you look at a lot of psychological studies, it's what we all crave most, apparently. Out of all our fears, the main thing at the top of the tree is that we're not alone. We all want to belong in a place, in a gang, in a family. And I think what happens, sadly, in a lot of communities, the family that's available, if you like, is usually, if you like, quite a negative culture, such as, I don't want to just focus on gangs. It could be, you know, drinking cider with your friends on the corner. It could be, you know, I don't know if they're dying out now, but you know, Hell's Angels used to be a thing when I was young. And so I think there's a whole thing of how can we engage young people at an early age into something quite positive and healthy. Because if we don't, then they tend to gravitate toward the negative, if you like.
Mm-hmm. And in some respects, when you see young people heading towards, if you like, belonging through a group that hold them, even if that's through negative behaviour, that you can isolate that in society. I mean, they do get isolated.
Yeah.
You can also pinpoint it. But what about the pressures and anxieties that men, if you like, who don't obviously belong to any negative culture, but they feel as if they have to be macho, the men who are dealing with maybe domestic violence that they find it difficult to own. There must be some men who do rape, since so many women are raped, but we never hear of any unless they're prosecuted. But certainly men going to the edge and the threshold of behaviour which they might be unhappy with. I mean, are they isolated? Are they able to talk about that anywhere?
I don't think, no. I mean, there are, you know, more and more, well, I say more and more, slowly but surely, I think there are communities now set up to support, for instance, paedophiles, which is a huge thing nobody ever wants to talk about. But of course, as we know, is prevalent in our society. And it's the same for, you know, there are several men's charities now that are being set up to support men who are violent, and to help them kind of break that down into, well, what is it? You know, what's contributed to this? There's a prison called Grendon. I haven't been involved in the prison service for a few years, but that was a particular prison that was set up for sex offenders. And when I say sex offenders, of all sorts. So there are a few things out there, but again, there aren't many forums. There's a lot of shame, as you say, attached to it. And I guess the answer, if there is an answer, it's to create more places that men can openly talk about these things, because if they don't, they'll do it again. Mm-hmm. That's what tends to happen. Mm-hmm. You know, if you're not helped, you'll do what you've been doing because it's what you know.
And this sort of silence around behaviour, the silence around behaviour that, you know, you could say was taboo or shameful, but there seems to be silence in general, or there has been, around even sort of casual misogyny or, you know, laddish sexism. There doesn't seem to be, I'll talk to Anthony about this, but there doesn't seem to be an easy way for men to call each other out on stuff, or just to say, you're probably struggling with something, can I help? Male friendship, from our discussions, seems not to contain much the chance for this permission to talk either.
Again, I think it's a huge problem. I mean, you know, if you know, the whole other side of counselling and psychotherapy, well, not a whole other side, the whole point of it is to become self-aware. So once you become self-aware of your own stuff, hopefully, at some stage, you're then more aware and more able, I think, to confront others. It's not an easy thing to do, and this whole Savile thing that we've spoken about this, you know, you think, well, what were the men doing when all this was going on? You know, people knew what was happening, but there wasn't the honesty to say, come on, what's going on here? You know, so again, I think we have to give ourselves permission to do that, to call each other on our stuff. You know, it might be that we're aware of it, it might be that we're not necessarily aware of it, but until someone tells us or we're caught, nothing changes. So I think you're right, there's a lot of that, and it is a bloke thing, of course, as well. It's a men thing generally, that they're less likely to confront each other, and that's for lots of reasons, I think. Again, perhaps violence, perhaps being a grass. There's this whole thing about snitching, you know, men tend to look away, and it's really sad.
So thanks, John. So Akala, one of the sessions we did for the men think-ins, you gave an incredible, because you're a fantastic historian, and you gave this kind of alternative moment when you said, you know, there are societies that aren't patriarchal, or there have been in history, and, you know, they can look like this. You know, you're one of not many men I have met who not only support feminism, but also are comfortable with the idea of being a bloke, a black bloke, who's a feminist and a historian, and navigating all of these different territories. But, you know, just give us a snapshot. Was it your history that made you understand where equality, what equality could look like?
Well, yeah, as I was saying in the talk, it was kind of accidental. By studying my own relationship with the history curriculum and understanding how I, even a man whose dad is African Jamaican and whose mother is Scottish, came to be born in London. So via my own personal journey, if you like, I came particularly to studying African history. And there were examples, I wouldn't necessarily say societies where there was equality, but there were certainly societies in which women occupied every social position. So some of the examples I gave in ancient Egypt, there were 5 female pharaohs we know of. The highest seat, even within the military, was often occupied by what was called a queen mother. So the biggest decisions in the society were made by an elder woman. In Nubia, there were a line of queens called the Candaces. So women occupying, in Dahomey, there were the Fon warriors. So all of these historical examples of ways in which even the conception of gender, one of the other things we spoke about was the Native American conception of homosexuality, is that people who are homosexual have twin spirits. So they are, whether they're male or female, if you're a person who's homosexual or bisexual, you are born with, say you're a man that's bisexual, you probably, they conceive it to be a man born with a female spirit. So their whole conception of gender is different. Does that mean that they have a utopia? No, it just means their approach to gender and then the outcome of it is different. And so for me, that journey and that information led to something that was very fascinating. It was only through, I suppose, studying the histories that were more directly important to me, the history of race, the history of class, histories of imperialism, that I came onto, and there's this really interesting angle and this whole other thing that as a man I've never even really thought about till my late 20s is the situation that women face. And I suppose learning some of those historical examples causes us to reflect, because we talk a lot about human nature. It's one of the things that I think is really lazy. We look at the bad things in the world and we say, it's human nature, it's just the way it is. And a lot of that comes from historical ignorance of potential difference. And so I think that that's one of the ways in which studying history gives us something to say, well, actually, if it hasn't always been exactly this way, there's no reason why it should always continue exactly this way. And that gives us something to point at and to aim at, not to romanticize the past, but to say if things were done slightly differently, what can we learn from those societies in which things were done differently.
You did several sessions in Being a Man, as John did, but one of them was about black male sexuality.
Yes.
And the fact that, white men use it because this is just me paraphrasing, right?
Yeah.
Men appear to be frightened of women's power. And because they seem to think it's something mysterious and they're quite not sure what it is, this is a very general thing, and then you get this massive pushback to stop it happening. And white men appear to be frightened of black men's sexual power, and they do the same. But your point was actually this is just one way of othering somebody, so they can occupy this other space, which you can then demean and humiliate.
Yeah, and the examples I gave were the film, the weird eugenics film before the 200 metres final, of course, Linford Christie, but it's a general, Fanon and others have spoke about it, but this, it's not just actually white men, actually. Even if we go to Salvador de Bahia, or we go to Gambia right now, or we go to Jamaica, there is a culture of black male prostitution, and the people engaging in that prostitution are almost all of them, Western white women. Why don't they go to Poland or to, I don't know, Israel? Why all these places where black men are? So this idea of black male virility and sexuality has been part of, and women, and black women, has been part of the justification for subjugation. Of course, it isn't necessarily based in reality, but it's been one of the ways in which you can psychologically put characteristics or deviance. Blackness is the agency of vice. You can put deviance onto blackness and use that as a means of control. But I think there are, at the root of it, also some very genuine fears of inadequacy, and that's a similar point I was making about sexuality with men and women. Is there are some biological differences between men and women that men have not accepted, have not got comfortable with, have not come to understand, have never been explained, and we've certainly never been given the tools to equip ourselves to understand them and react to them, if you like, without going crazy.
But what struck me about the conversation was that even, so you're a man and John's a man, and you're all men, but the taboo around let's discuss attitudes to black sexuality is so rarely discussed. I don't suppose you go to the pub to have a chat about it very often. And, so even if men can't even talk to each other about these differences, it makes it even harder, I think, to imagine a conversation where they're unlocking the story with women. Because I suppose a mystery to me was knowing that black men, just to use it that way for a minute, had some of the same issues as white women in terms of being marginalised. Why did black men not become instant feminists? Now, that's a very naive thing to say, but when I was about 17, I thought, well, they're bound to be. I realised that wasn't the case, because the man thing seems to be stronger than any other of the issues of marginalisation. Being a man finally seems to be the card.
I think it is and it isn't. I think that where race and gender meet, it just becomes very complicated, and it's not simplistic. Even many of the revolutionary movements were still very sexist, either intentionally or unintentionally. But I think that it is, for black African Caribbean men specifically, there is a type of commodification and objectification that men generally are not subjected to. And so it creates a strange psychosis. Because we're men, we're not taught that that's bad. In the world, as a man, to be promiscuous, to be the object of desire, to be the sexual predator, to be the strong guy, is desirable. And so therefore it's almost a trip up, because on the one hand, a lot of it's quite racist, really. But on the other hand, it's like, well, who doesn't want to be the guy that everyone fancies? Even if all black men don't look like Linford Christie, which clearly we all don't. That archetype and that idea that is attached to our supposed power is like a gift and a curse. And so it's difficult to give up, especially when you're in a situation where you're powerless. And a lot of the images in hip-hop and dancehall music and all this other culture has never really been unpicked in that context, where if other forms of power are closed to you, but this form of power is open, even if it's demeaning, it's a form of power you want to access. And you see that along all kind of marginalized groups. But yeah, certainly we're not all feminists at this point.
Anthony, let me come to you, because you created a program, a schools program, going out and talking to young boys about behaviour. I think that's probably the way to do it. About choices that they could make, alternative choices that they could make, whilst being clearly somebody who's coming from the same life experiences they have, which is a kind of important ingredient. Could you just tell us a bit about how that came about and what you do?
So I go into schools and I say to young people, I write poems, and they say, "What, you?" "Oh yeah, me." "You with that hair and the beard, you write poems?" Yeah, me. And they straight away link poetry to something that is incredibly effeminate. Or are you gay? You have to be gay to be able to write poems. And what I've realised is that by doing this, I was able to not only say to some of the hardest kids in school, the most troubled kids, that you can talk about your dad hitting your mum in a poem, and you can talk about your big brother going to prison, and you haven't got to be ashamed, You haven't got to feel it's wrong. And you can get up and you can talk about it to your friends in a very articulate and intellectualized and artistic way. And what it does is it creates kind of a bond between groups of boys who, in the playground, would just spend the time cussing each other. And they wouldn't talk about his big brother going to prison and him coming home at 4 o'clock and seeing his mum with her head split open on the floor because the dad's had a tantrum. And these kind of things completely change the dynamic of dealing with trauma through art therapy. Be able to structure and organise your life experience and your internal world through an artistic medium is an incredible cathartic experience, especially for boys who are taught the only way you can communicate is through your fists or your penis, one of the two. So that whole thing there, I realised started to create some thinking. And my most recent observation was, what is permissible? A hierarchy of permissible tolerance within schools. And by that I mean, when a kid says something racist to another kid, straight away they'll either get suspended, they'll get kicked out of the class, parents will get called in. There's a big problem. You call someone a racist term, it's on in the classroom. The second within the rank is homophobia. If you are homophobic towards someone, you call someone gay, faggot, whatever it might be, the teacher will say, "Oi, out, get out, I want to see you at the end of the lesson, we're going to call your parents in." The third, the one that nobody talks about, and I've seen it all the time, is sket, bitch, whore, hoe. No one says, "Aaron, get out." They'll say, "Aaron, stop that, sit down, behave yourself." And that's it. And for young boys, when that happens, I've actually sat down and had we're stopping the lesson now. We're not doing lessons. I don't care for the textbook. Why? Why did you use this term? And teachers don't do that because they're fixed into a curriculum. They're trying to help these kids pass an exam without realizing that you've got to help them pass life at the same time. You give them life skills and have these conversations with them. And that's kind of what I try and use poetry as a way of getting in and having this, breaking down these kind of the paradigm that men can't be sensitive. And I say to kids, you kicked the hell out of him last week. Yeah, I was sick. Yeah, that's an emotion. Violence is an incredible emotion. It's not just women who get emotional. Men do. But when a woman does and she cries, we can't do that. Whereas a man can cry, as long as it's when England win the football game. That's when you're allowed to cry. Or when you get a promotion, or when your kid's born. But then if your woman's having an argument with you and she starts crying, you say you've been irrational, you're breaking down. Whereas violence is incredibly irrational. And men can just get violent whenever they want, and it's not really regarded and defined as an emotional response to something. So men are just, and when I tell this to the young guys, they go, "I never thought of it like that."
So John, everybody here will do what they do as we all do because there's some trigger in their own life that makes them go, right, I experienced this and so I'll do this. You didn't grow up presumably with these thoughts.
No.
So what happened that made you decide to do it?
Misogyny. I grew up in a very patriarchal, I'm from Cyprus, it's a very male-dominated culture. The women do one thing, the men do something completely different, usually involving politics and philosophy and the higher things. The women are cooking and cleaning and making sure that their kids are ready for bed. And so you grow up inheriting these ideas of gender. And what happened was when I hit my mid-20s, I realised, I would sleep with a woman and not call her back. And I would go and have a fight and tell my friends about it. And the women that I sleep with, I tell my friends about it. And what I realised was that I was constantly looking for male validation. Everything that I did within that bravado, within that machismo, I'd go and tell another man. I wouldn't tell another woman, I'd tell a man. Because I wanted a man to say, "Nice one." Because my dad didn't say, "Nice one," ever, to me. Same way I used to go to the gym. I wasn't going to the gym for the women. I was going to the gym so a guy could say, "Ray, you look sick." And you don't realise it's incredibly homoerotic to go there and to realise you're training for other men as a heterosexual. It was a weird thing, and that's when I kind of started to realise that it is the validation that my father never gave me as a child that made me want the approval of men so much, which is why I was always showing off around men and watch how many press-ups I can do and watch how many women I can get and blah, blah, blah. And it just went on like that for a very, very long time until you realise it's completely counterproductive. And
why did you realise?
Because a lot of women were calling me an arsehole. And and I thought, I'm not actually, I'm just a bit confused. So, and that's kind of, and you need that. You need the reality check, because otherwise you're not going anywhere. So I'm thankful that they did. It was a good thing.
Thank you. Okay, Shawnee, I'm going to come to you last, but Tim, when you started something called Men's Hour, and I remember people laughing, and they still do, and they go, it's every hour's Men's Hour, like, why do you need a men's festival? Every day's a men's festival. But you obviously had a kind of instinct that it needed a place where men could talk, sometimes flippantly, but sometimes seriously, about the stuff that really men experience and men understand. So what started that, and how do you think since you began it, what's happening around you? Do you feel as if that's become more urgent, those conversations? Have you got more permission to do a men's hour? Could you do men's week? Tell us about that.
I mean, for me, it started with just sort of looking at men's magazines which were on the shelves and just, seeing watches, airbrush boobs, more watches, clothes, cars, and just thinking, I don't know who this speaks to anymore. I mean, I briefly worked on GQ before joining the BBC in the late 90s, and it was sort of out of date then. And then I thought, 10 years later, I just thought, this is crazy. There's nowhere which speaks to men as they are, which is kind of much more emotionally evolved than these magazines would give us credit for. So my motivation was to try and come up with somewhere in the media which spoke to men as I sensed they might have been. I mean, the reaction when we launched, as you say, was just a lot of women pissing themselves, and a lot of female columnists thinking it was absolutely hilarious. I mean, not that the show was any good when we first launched, but we got there and we're back on air in a couple of weeks. Given that I'm hugely jet lagged, so I thought I've just been in America doing something fairly daft for American TV, looking for real men, and I've been learning how to be a cowboy, and I can tell you my lassoing skills are much better than
they were.
Than they were. He knew, coming from Manchester, he had a natural penchant for lassoing. So I brought a clip which I thought might at least kind of make some more sense than me trying to deal with jet lag, which was, it's two things pushed together. We did a lot on mental health in the last series. John was talking about the terrible rates of sort of male mental health. So we kind of tried to address that full on, and we did a lot about sort of guys just talking very honestly about sort of depression, anxiety, and that sort of stuff. So there's a clip from a guy talking about his experience of slightly melting down, and then we just got a clip with the lovely comedian Omid Jalili talking about his weight. So I think at this point I say someone like Hugh Stewart, but Stewart's talking to Claudia. So audio or video? It's just audio. So. This is like the radio show, this is an excellent.
I wasn't able to say to friends, I didn't feel able to say to friends, I'm really struggling. I was kind of going into the toilet at work to either cry or try and avoid crying, because I didn't want anybody to see that I was upset, and I'd just hide. In retrospect, that was a bit silly. And had I felt able to talk to somebody at that stage, then maybe I would have, the problems that I had later on could have been avoided. But yeah, you feel kind of under pressure to be, almost like to be strong.
And to look at you, a big guy, tattoo, shaved head, this is nothing about what you look like. This is nothing about what, masculinity. This is about something which is just going on inside, which you can't really put your finger on.
We think of mental health in a very, very different way than we do physical health. If you've got a bloke in a pub and he's torn his ACL, his cruciate ligament, blokes will quite happily talk till the cows come home about rehabilitation and crutches and all this kind of stuff. But if the bloke says, I've just been diagnosed with depression, or I had a panic attack last week, blokes will run a mile rather than engage with that or talk about it. But actually, those kind of problems are far more common than most physical health problems.
Night run of stand-up billed, after much agonising, as Omid Jalili Live. Omid is one of the more thoughtful comics out there.
I've never been this honest and open about my physical, things happening to my body and happening to my mind and the thoughts you have.
You've sort of referred to it a couple of times. Are you quite conscious about your weight?
I wish I could say I am what I am, take it or leave it, but actually the real reality is I struggle with it. Probably every half an hour I think about, maybe I can just not eat for today and maybe I'll lose half an ounce, and I think about it all the time. I am a short, fat, bald man. That's the thing. It's really horrible because, believe it or not, I keep telling everybody I used to be quite good looking. I used to have girls say, oh my goodness, you're my dream man. I get gay guys now saying, oh, hairy bear, short fat man, you're my perfect man. So it's a shame that that's really changed. But it is shocking. And I think if I just lose a bit of weight, I just like 1.5 stone, 2 stone, I would transform and maybe people find me attractive again. But then again, I probably wouldn't have a comedy career.
We've done a lot of mental health. We kind of try and speak to celebrities about stuff they don't normally talk about, and there's more flippant stuff as well. It's not all sort of woe is man. Sometimes it's a sort of celebration of being a man, and have fairly candid chats about one night stands and that sort of thing. So, but I think just kind of one of the sort of misconceptions that we sort of faced was that therefore you're in opposition to feminism, and that it's kind of really wide of the mark. I mean, I think that most men nowadays would say that they are fairly feminist. Depending on how you define feminism, and it's I really wouldn't even want to go there. But in terms of most guys, would say, well, yeah, of course, everyone should have equal opportunities. There's no issues with that. I don't have any problem with that. This isn't to address that. This is just to say, actually, we salute and celebrate that, but men have a tough time. There's a lot of challenging things for men today. It's seen in the sort of stuff, in prison and with mental health, and just a lot of kind of existential angst and men not really knowing what's going on and not having that conversation. So, in terms of your question as to whether now feels less kind of idiotic and less alone, I guess the fact that we're doing this here in January at the Southbank, the fact that we're talking about it again today, the Daily Telegraph now has a men's section. It feels as though the momentum is shifting, and that you can still be a bloke, you can like football, but you can still want to kind of talk about things which are maybe three-dimensional.
Mm-hmm. And if you took feminism as a definition being an equal world for men and women, the whole world hasn't signed up to that, we know that. Mm. So I assume what you mean is that in this country, most men would nod in general agreement. Most, probably, I don't know. I don't even know whether I think that's true, but it doesn't matter at this point. But the issue of then what that looks like for men becomes quite contentious quite quickly. There is, I think, a general feeling is that if somebody gains, somebody must lose. I mean, that's something we're taught generally, that the world is a kind of competitive place where somebody's gain is somebody's loss. And so I'm wondering how much that idea of men sort of losing something that was a certainty, even if they didn't necessarily want it, but it was what they had. If that's part of what's going on.
But I don't think men are pointing the finger. Okay, I talk men. I say, the generation of men coming through now in this country today, I don't think point the finger at women and say, oh, it's because of you lot that my job security has now been lost and the trade union movement has broken down. I don't know what job I'm going to do in 40 years' time, and house prices are going up and being a dad's really hard. I think it's, as I see it, men and women equally would just say, that the challenges of modern life are pretty tough, and if you have a supportive partner throughout that, that's probably a good thing. I don't think there's a kind of anger or sort of resentment, I guess, from my generation, against women. I think it's just kind of more like life's quite hard because our expectations that we've been force-fed are really hard to meet as you get older.
And you don't think that you don't think you're referring to a particular class of men who might have decided that's what they think? I mean, I think that misogyny and the expressions of misogyny still seem to be there, in violence, in rape, in trolling. I mean, all kinds of things like that. So, are you that secure that men feel okay?
I don't think. I mean, I think these are things which have been ever present. I think there isn't a sort of seething resentment against women. I think the only time I ever really hear that expressed is maybe with the odd kind of female boss who's a bit of a nightmare, and the thing comes, well, she's trying to outbloke the blokes, and maybe there is some truth in that. But I think there is cause for optimism. I know it's kind of unfashionable to say so, but there's cause for optimism of each generation of man who is coming through, who I think does genuinely see women as equals and peers.
Good, that's great to hear that. Shawnee, so you deal with a lot of young men, as you say, and young fathers who I know that you feel quite strongly are excluded from support and excluded from knowledge which would help them be good fathers. And one of the things that came up in being a man over and over again was relationship to fathers. I mean, all the thinkings I've done with women over the years, they don't talk about their mothers very much, actually. I mean, it's not that they don't like their mothers, but mainly they do, or if they've got problems with them, that's a kind of personal thing. But with men, they just talked about the fact that they didn't get on with their dads, or didn't know their dads, or their dads were emotionally absent. Very few men actually went, my dad's great, and he taught me everything I know, and and he hugs me. That's so rare. But with the young men, so they taught all the time about lack of role model of fatherhood. And obviously that's the situation that you're often dealing with, isn't it? Amongst other things.
Yeah, last year it was announced that more children in this country are growing up without fathers than ever before. That is a really, really worrying concern. We are living in a real broken society, and we need to look at why are children growing up without their fathers? What is happening? I work and specialise with a group in society that lots of people barely ever think about, and that's young dads. These are young men who in some ways are invisible almost. Services for them is so fragmented and less limited. Now, it's not that they don't exist. They do, because I work with them every single day. They don't have a voice. Now, what's really important, you guys all being here today to listen to us, is the fact that there's young men out there who come into contact every single day when they're expectant fathers. The first practitioners and professionals that they meet are female. From the client base that I work with, what I know is that the young men have grown up without their own dads, and that they have dropped out of school very early, and that they don't really have any real male role models in their lives at all that exist. So I'm going to give you the opportunity to hear first-hand accounts of what it's like to be a young father in a modern day Britain. Two young men talking about their experiences of being young dads.
When I found out I was going to be a dad, it sort of made me sit back and be a bit worried, because I was worried that I was going to be a failure. My parents failed me when I was a kid. I had mine at the age when I was 21. I'm 23 now, so that's my prime years really of
Okay, George,
being
start
a
again.
young
Sorry.
adult.
Don't worry. awful pressure at that moment. So I'll vamp. Just while you're waiting...
I wasn't able to say to friends, or didn't feel able to say to friends, I'm really struggling. You know, I was kind of going to the toilet at work to either cry or try and avoid crying, because I didn't...
Okay, while you're doing that, let me just give you some statistics, which is that 46,000 primary schools in this country have no male teachers. And of all the rest of the primary school teachers, only 1 in 5 in those schools are male. There are almost no male nursery, pre-school men around. So education and caring, nurturing, every image is really a woman. At the same time as being told that women aren't as important as men, if you see what I mean. So that combination is really, I think, to Shani's point, it's a kind of a lethal combination of the idea that fathers are unnecessary and also sort of peculiar if they end up being nurturing. Now, whatever that is, that's not always the case in every part of the class system, but it certainly is the case in imagery across the whole country. So I don't know whether already, was that a good filler? Yeah.
When I found out that I was going to be a dad, it sort of made me sit back and be a bit worried, because I was worried that I was going to be a failure. Like my parents failed me when I was a kid. I had mine when I was 21. I'm 23 now, so that's my prime years really of being a young adult and doing things and going out and clubbing and stuff like that. But where I turned to dad and everything and stuff, it does change a lot of things. It made me want to be a dad. It makes me want to sit down and not go out getting into trouble with the police or go out clubbing and stuff. It made me focus on my daughter because I had something to focus on.
I was born in St. Lucia and that, and then I don't know my mum and that, innit. She left me when I was first born, innit. And then being in care, coming from a rough background and that, it's hard because they don't understand where you're coming from, innit. Like, they're just quick to judge you and that. I feel happy, innit, because it's the best thing in the world, innit, to just have a little child and that, and just care for it and that, just be there for your child. It's the best thing, innit? It's the best thing in the world.
My early years experience of me being neglected has impacted on the way I am now. When I found out I was having a kid, immediately social services got involved because they thought that the way I was brought up when I was a kid, that I would think that was correct. So I've had to prove to social services for over 3 years that I'm not like that.
The mothers and that, they get more help and that. Like other people put more support on them, innit, because they're carrying the baby, they're looking after the baby and that. With us young dads, like, we just there, innit, because like no one really hears them out, innit. Like no one's really there to help them and that.
Even if social services don't make you feel welcome, you should always listen to what they say, because they're not there for you, they're there for the kids. And they only want what's best for the kids, like you only want what's best for your kids. Working with young dads have been a great support towards me. They've helped me find other organisations that help me with my daughter, and they still work with me now, and they're still a great support. Best thing about me being a dad is watching my daughter having fun, laughing, making new friends, and just watching her grow up and watching her from doing stuff that she couldn't do to stuff that she can do now.
My message really isn't, I guess, to you. It's to society as a whole. It's to think about when, particularly in the health and social care sector, that when you bring a young mum in for her first antenatal checkup, I mean, I'm not addressing a group of midwives or health visitors here today, but most health visitors and most midwives and social workers in this country it's a female-dominated work environment. And if we start thinking about the role that young fathers can play in the upbringing and the development of their children, and we engage them effectively, and we make them feel important, and we make them understand their responsibility and what it means to be a dad, and we don't exclude them, then that young man will more likely stay around to raise his child. And that isn't happening the way it should be in this current day in a society that we live in. Hence why young men end up walking away from the responsibility of their children's lives because they've never really felt involved from the get-go. I see young men going into wanting to be there at the birth of their child, and midwives and other health professionals telling them that they're in the way, but yet the mother of the expectant mum is allowed to be in the room with her, and the dad's in the waiting room because he feels like he doesn't really have a role to play. More often than not, relationships, particularly with young parents, break down after the birth of the baby. And then when the dad feels that he can't put his name in the birth certificate because he has to be there with the mum, the power inequality is very evident. The dad can walk away. He feels he's never really got a place to begin with. And I think we need to start thinking about how important young men are, young expectant dads are, young fathers are in the roles of children's lives.
Now, you're a gay man and you're also a father.
It's true.
And that's an incredible liberation step that's happened. And I think Anthony's right in saying that, actually sexual rights have won more ground, won more acceptance perhaps than gender equality has. But as a gay young father dealing with other young fathers, are they finding that this notion of being emotional, allowing themselves to be emotional, allowing themselves to be tender, allowing all of those things, and also allowing themselves to be wrong, to make mistakes, is that something which you're trying to train them to think about, giving themselves permission to be an emotional, loving, physical dad?
It's interesting. I think that even for me as a gay father, and doing and running the practice that I run, I'm still on a journey myself in terms of being able to understand emotion in the context of being a man and in the context of being a father. And I mean, it's funny, I did a couple of panels at the Being a Man festival at the end of January, and it took almost that festival and to do those talks to realise that I've got daddy issues. And I think some of those unresolved issues come from growing up in a very heterosexualized environment as a young person, and not really, the idea of homosexuality. I mean, when I was a kid, I thought a homosexual was someone who had sex indoors. The idea of being gay just didn't exist, and I kind of grew up with that mindset. So I'm still coming to terms with being a gay man as a father. My son has. You're probably wondering, how the hell did that all happen? Long story, it's another talk. My son has 2 African mums, lesbian couple, and what I try to tell my clients I work with is that, what's really important is this message that we send out to our daughters and our young people in general. It's almost like a game from the very beginning. We have to break that misconception that as a young woman, you have to find a man. You have to settle down. He will almost look after you, and it's just this romanticization of what a woman's role is in society. And I tell the dads that that we try to let your daughters understand what it means to be independent, they don't need to rely on a man, and they will be much happier. Because lots of the dads that I work with have never had the opportunity from a father figure to tell them what's important in life. And I think that's very, very important. Them understanding emotion, and I work with lots of dads who, for example, are perpetrators of domestic abuse, where they've grown up in households where abuse was normal for them, and that normalization has continued into their adulthood. And so I'm working with lots of young men who come from very different walks of life and very different issues, but in the context of fatherhood, I have to tie them back into what it means to be a dad, and that's really difficult. How do you make a 17-year-old young man from Brixton, which is kind of the area I work in, whose dad has never been around, they don't really have any male role models, and they're about to become a dad, and they don't really know what that means. How do you make him be excited about being a father and making him understand that he's going to be responsible for a young child's life for the remainder of his days? And that is really, really difficult. But I really believe in them, and I really believe society needs to consider the way young fathers are represented.
Thank you. Yeah. Great. Well, I think at this, we could talk a lot about fathers, and in fact, just looking at the panel, I know that an awful lot of the men who came forward to contribute to being a man had often thought a great deal about the balance of society and the balance of power and the issue of emotion, because they had absence in their life, and they had to figure out, well, was this their problem, or was it actually to do with the structures that they were given that had gone wrong? And I think that's an interesting thing in itself. But I'd like to hand the floor over to the audience now to ask questions or make comments. The kind of the purpose of the panel really is to tell you the kind of things that came up at being a man, and there were loads and loads of topics. And also, since you are largely women, whereas the Being a Man Festival was largely men in the audience, do you as women feel that a Being a Man Festival and the content that you're hearing today actually helps an understanding? Is it helpful? So who'd like to ask a question or make a comment? There's somebody there. If you pass them the microphone.
Hi there. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, and if we can't, I'll translate back.
Okay. I've actually done quite a lot of studying on my master's degree into masculinity, and I'm quite interested because feminists have had to kind of really understand the construction of femininity and the multifaceted and intersectionality of being female and what femininity actually means. Whereas I think men just haven't come as far in examining what masculinity means. For example, Anthony, you were talking about being a poet is now seen as gay. But in the past, Lord Byron, mad, bad, dangerous to know, it was an incredibly masculine and virile thing to be a poet. So things do change historically and cross-culturally, but a lot of the men I talk to outside of my master's degree, and a lot on the master's degree as well actually, they still haven't really grasped the concept of masculinity as a social construction. And the problem of the male jobs is that, being primary school teachers, when jobs start to become done by women, they become devalued. There's lots of examples of this. Like in Russia, doctors are not paid very well, and that's because in Russia, most doctors are female. So we have that. Society devalues things, and it isn't just the norm. It is something that we've all got a responsibility to help deconstruct and make visible.
Okay, thank you. Could you pass the microphone back to the person behind you? I'm going to take a few questions at the same time and then come back to them. Thanks.
Hi, I just wanted to say that sort of female issues and gender issues have been something that I've been quite interested in since university. I haven't done a master's or anything in it. It's just a subject I read about and I like to keep up with. But I sort of came to the conclusion quite a while ago that male issues as well were a huge part of it. I sort of felt that it was a wider issue than just female gender equality. And I was really delighted to see the BAM Festival. I was too late to get a ticket, unfortunately. They were all sold out. So that's why I'm here today. My main issue, though, is I'm a trainee solicitor, and I've just started, and really enjoying it, but I'm in an intake, and it's 50-50 men and women. It's fine. It's just that there's a society, a women's society, and a lot of the women in the intake talk about it in front of the men, but the main problem is we get it's very difficult for them to even approach, or even to talk about it to the guys and say, well, this is an issue for you as well, or to get them involved, to get them to even see it without just a general dismissal. They all assume I'm about to sort of burn my bra or something at them, and that's not what I'm talking about. They just think feminism, that's what you're talking about, and I'm not. I'm trying to explain that it could be their issue as well. So I don't quite know how to do that succinctly without looking like a mad person.
Right, okay. That's the issue of communication. Can you pass it to this man here? And then we'll come to the end. Anybody over there?
Hello, yes. I came up to Jude at the end of the BAM, and I said to her that I wanted to talk about feminism. I've been a feminist for 30 years, after reading The Female Eunuch. So I'd really like there to be a forum where those of us men who do identify as feminists can talk with you who are feminists together. And there's so much to talk about. We've only scratched the surface here, and it hardly even touched at BAM. So I'd really like for that to happen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And then just take one more, then we'll come back to panel. Yes, somebody there? Yeah. And then next time I'll come over this side.
Hi, that was a really fascinating panel. Thanks very much. I was at the dairy version of WOW with Jude. Hi. And my father came to it on the Saturday, and Jude gave a speech on the Saturday morning just about WOW and what the whole thing was for and her views on feminism. And I got a call from my dad straight after this talk, and my dad's in his early 60s, Belfast man, saying, Catherine, I need your help. And I was like, right, okay. And he said, I have always been a passive feminist. I've always supported your mum and her friends, and I really believe that I try to do all that I can, but now I want to be an active feminist. What can I do? Big question. So that's something I would love to hear discussed, advice I could give him really, and how he could be more involved.
Great. Okay, so the issues here are, it seems to be early days for analysis, political analysis around masculinity and the constructs that have come about from that. And as a result as well, people then keep reverting back to stereotypes and don't even know their own history, which is of course true of women as well. There's another issue, which is that, and it's slightly to do with what you just said, that you get lumped into, well, if it's women's issues, it doesn't need men's involvement. And how do men accept the fact that women's issues are men's issues, and therefore feminism is something like racism? It belongs inside all of us. So what about, Carla, let me start with you, the politics of masculinity, the sort of political framework. Do you think it is early days?
Well, power buys ignorance. And what I mean by that is, when you are dominant, when you are powerful, you don't have to unpick your identity because there's nothing forcing you to do so. So if I asked most of, for example, the white feminist women in this room how the white race was invented, for example, what was that process? I would probably understand much more than you would, because my own history vis-a-vis whiteness has forced me to interrogate that and understand, in Jamestown in America in 1619, when slavery was across racial groups, one of the things the powers that be in charge did was create a color-coded hierarchy. That's not to say ideas of difference had never existed before, but the power vacuum in relation to skin color was a new thing in world politics. And around European power, the white race was invented. It didn't precede it. The Vikings didn't see the Irish people they were enslaving as part of the same race. And I suppose gender works in the same way. Male power means that we can just assume what it means to be men. We don't need to unpick it. We don't need to think about it. Because we can feel what the political consequences are. And the last thing we want is the people that we benefit from being on top of telling us, what comes back to what you were saying earlier. I think it's easy for men to say, men who are economically secure, men who live in a quote-unquote developed, rich industrial society, to say we want equality. It's very easy and you get a lot of points for it. Doesn't mean you practically want that, because men will have to lose some things. If women become equal, it's obvious. There's no power without someone being powerless. And so I think that part of our willful ignorance is about maintaining unearned privilege. We're born into the world. Anyone who's worked with primary school children knows that boys are not born smarter than girls. It's fairly obvious. In fact, I would argue, it seems clear to me, girls develop intellectually actually a bit quicker. That's just an empirical observation. I'm not saying it's scientific, but from all the primary school groups I've worked with, which is hundreds of groups, girls seem to learn to read faster. Maybe that's societal. They grow quicker. You know, there seems to be a lot going on, and maybe part of sexism is about retarding that. Men have noticed that. So I think that you keep that willful ignorance and don't want your identity unpicked, because once you unpick it and once you own it, there's something on the table that might be lost. And so I think that's where getting men to try and understand what the idea of masculinity is has its difficulties, because
yes,
there is something.
There's a resistance to feeling like that doesn't need to be known.
I mean, and just sort of stemming on from that, you know, I think there's an image question, which is something which I know Jude and I discussed right at the beginning when talking about BAM, which is, you know, you have to recognise that men are still dominant, and when a dominant group bangs on about its rights, it tends to come across as really naff or a bit uncool. You know, it's like sort of saying that, you know, white English people are oppressed in this country. It's just a bit uncool to say that. And so, you know, for men to start banging on about men's rights, as soon as you kind of call it that, it puts a lot of men off and it makes you look like a bit of a tosspot. So where it seems to kind of have more headway is actually to worry less about this kind of umbrella term around men's rights or masculinity and stuff, but actually say these are the specific issues which, when you highlight them, make you know, shocking. You know, when you look at kind of male suicide rates as 3 times as high, or prison rates, or male victims of domestic abuse, or kids' performance at school, that sort of thing, you can't argue with that sort of stuff, and it feels very tangible and concrete and something which you can gather around. But when you just say, oh, it's about male rights and stuff, that in itself creates an image problem which puts a lot of men off, leads to a lot of women laughing at you, and doesn't necessarily push it forward. So I think my sensible recommendation would be to kind of make it a bit more specifically issue-led, and then see what kind of gels together afterwards.
But I mean, I understand what you're speaking about, and from your experience, Anthony, you sort of had to find a way of rethinking your approach and then communicating it to others. There wasn't a body of work that you could turn to, you know, that said, look, here's the writing that there has been to date about the situation you find yourself in. Would you have liked there to have been?
Absolutely. Just the other week, actually, one of the students came up to me at the end after we had the whole discussion about the kind of the slurs that men give to women. He came up to me and he said to me, "Sir, can I ask you a question privately?" And I said to him, "Yeah, cool, man, sit down." And he said, "How do I do it?" I said, "Do what?" "How do I be a good man? How do I be a good guy?" And I didn't know what to say, because I can't try and say, "Here, I'll read Simone de Beauvoir, read bell hooks, read this." Where do I go? When a 14-year-old boy says, "I know that the way that I think and how I regard women and sex and promiscuity is wrong, I can see it. Tell me what to do." There was literally MTV video. Don't watch an MTV video. I ain't got a dad. Cool. So where do you go? And this is the problem, is that there is this massive gulf within, there's not even a term for it, where the men who are trying to undo misogyny and trying to undo patriarchy, where do you go? And I was left thinking, wow, that's actually insane. Like, there's so many men, it's what Kingsley was saying, there's so many men. And because the privilege is something that you have to constantly keep maintaining, we don't want that conversation. We can theorize and talk about it in places very amicable like this, but once we leave them doors, I go back to being a bloke and I benefit from blokeness, and you guys go back to being females, and it stops. And that's the problem, is that what's part 2? We can sit around and talk fluffy words all day long, but out there it's real. 120 women in 2012 were killed by domestic violence, 48 killed by guns. That's in Great Britain. That says conversations have to happen outside of places like this.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to defend, as I know you would want me to, the idea of them happening in places like this, because you get the courage to have them outside. I mean, taking your point about how do you go back to your chambers and have the conversation with men that goes, don't marginalise me as hysterical and self-obsessed about women, but actually this is a joint venture, this whole thing. And so, John, I mean, the idea of moving from women's issues, because it is strange to me. I'm chairing a panel at 3:30 on rape, where women are going to testify, if you like, to their situations in order to inform women and men who come what the situations of rape are actually about and the aftermath and the dealing with it and so on. But why is rape a woman's issue? And why is domestic violence a woman's issue? And why are any of these things a woman's issue, in your opinion, John? When can they become universal issues? What's the resistance in men to acknowledging that there must have been a relationship to men into these things that seem to be about women, including childcare? Sorry, it's a huge question.
It's a huge question, and I'm thinking on my feet. Well, my only image today, and I don't know if it's available, was of a sat-nav, and I don't know if it's there it is. It's just a normal sat-nav that you use to get around town, and I do a lecture on this to young people. I work a bit in football, and the reason I use the image of the sat-nav is because it's a kind of pre-programmed thing. So I ask the lads, it's usually boys, what is it, the sat-nav, how, you put in your place, you want to get around town, yeah, do you trust it, yeah, usually, does it get you to where you're going, yeah, usually. So I use this kind of image as our own psychology, we're all pre-programmed, like it or not, and like we said today already, and until you become aware of that map, those maps, you're going to carry on doing what you're doing. And again, I think some of the guys have touched on witnessing domestic violence as a child. So if daddy does it, it's kind of okay to do it, or it's not really okay, but he did it, so maybe I'd do it. I think that the thing about rape is again, it's too complex for me to go in. I'm not even, I'm not trained enough to go there, really, if I'm honest. I'm not, I've dealt with it with women, I've dealt with it with men, and I think, and I don't want to blame the online availability of pornography too much, but I think that kind of certainly seems to be playing into a lot of this stuff these days.
But in a way, really, the question I've got, and I'm not asking you to be too specific, is this idea that there are women's issues.
Yeah.
That the world is male,
yeah,
and then there are women's issues.
Yeah.
And those issues seem to be ones where men go, well, I don't have to engage on that one, which really leaves your boys stranded, actually. Because if childcare is a woman's issue, but they find that they are responsible for children, and that's why there's no resources for them, presumably, because it's not really a boy's thing.
Well, it leaves them completely conflicted.
Yeah.
I ran a consultation recently with a group of young mums and dads looking at the issue of domestic abuse in relationships, and I feel that talking to young people about violence in the home and talking about abusive relationships, for lots of adults, it's like they're almost afraid to start those conversations with them. They initiate the conversation. So I delivered a consultation with young people. They start talking about the issues, and what I found was that, time and time again, lots of young mums would say, "Oh, when he hit me, at that time I deserved it," and they believed that they deserved to be hurt physically or emotionally, and that was really worrying. But what was positive was that we had young dads form part of the consultations, so they got to hear first-hand accounts from the females. This is what men are doing to them, and I think it's talking about the issues, but in a manner where we bring men and women together, and it's not like them and us. and it's about not men maybe accepting responsibility for their actions as such, but it's about understanding that the impact their actions has on women. And for the young fathers I work with, yes, they're completely conflicted. They walk into children's centres every day with their kids, and all they see in there is pictures of women and children. There's no male members of staff. I've got dads who walk into children's centres, they ask about advice, but because they don't actually have their kid with them physically, they're told to leave. And not only have we got a generation of young fathers who I said we don't acknowledge, but we have a generation of fathers who don't actually have their kids living with them, non-resident dads who aren't even considered fathers by society because they don't have their children with them 24/7, and they have personal internal conflict about being a dad, but not being a dad because their kid's not with them because it lives with a mum most of the time. Mm-hmm. And there's lots of issues that we could talk about today.
I suppose this all comes back to the fact that, there just haven't been enough conversations. Because when you think about it, when everybody says, well, clearly violence isn't a woman's issue, and clearly male depression is not a male issue. I think looking at the faces of the women sitting here, with men we love, you go male depression, if men have got that problem and they're not being able to talk, we must gather around and do something to support. So it's a kind of a strange moment to feel as if men and women need to get together, since they've obviously been getting together for years, otherwise we wouldn't have any population. But but it feels to me that an inevitable next step is we can't keep sort of pinning these problems into separate camps. We've got to find some shared language. I'm wondering whether anybody over here wanted to raise an issue. Yes, two women there, and then somebody at the front row. The lady at the back with the grey jumper. Yes.
Working in education, primary. With excluded children, at the age of 5 already, it's ridiculous. But I would like to know from BAM, was there any pledge that was made? Anything? Okay, this is what we would like to do. I will have to definitely get in touch with some people here. But from BAM, did you guys say, okay, this is what we would like to happen for our next generation?
Okay, could you pass on now to this lady on the front row with the interesting boots?
Hi, thank you. I've really enjoyed the talk so far today. It's been really interesting, some in particular. I do have 2 questions, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I'll be very quick. The first one is, I kind of wanted to touch on this idea of, the internet and being a man and misogyny and so on and so forth, because last year I was on online dating, and I was quite shocked by the amount of weirdly misogynistic, chauvinistic attitudes on online profiles and things like that, especially of, men, and we're talking, young men of dateable age. So, and plus the idea of, trolling and all sorts, there seems to be a lot of misogynistic kind of attitudes online. And it's brought to my attention more that, female journalists seem to have a hard time writing online too, and they often get trolled and so on. Yeah. So, are these attitudes have always been there, that are just coming because the internet's there, or is it a backlash by young men against women? Is this, because it seems to me it's becoming more apparent. My second question is about culture, ethnicity, and gender and cultural attitudes. So, coming from a Chinese background, I've been brought up with a Chinese culture in mind, but in a Western setting, and there are lots of attitudes that come along with tradition, and the real difficulty is growing up deciding whether to abandon certain cultural traditional attitudes and adopt Western ones, because those are actually more beneficial for you as a woman and also as a man, because I have a brother. And, and we make this really quite tough decision about whether to abandon our heritage, really. And it's something that people back in, Asia don't have to think about so much as, because they're already within their dominant culture. But as an ethnic minority here, you have to always balance out, the cultural question.
FGM, in this country, has had that frontline discussion, hasn't it? Huge questions.
So how do we do that?
Good questions. There's 2 more. There's one here and then one there, and then that's got to be the end of it. No, it's here. There's a lady on the front with the denim jacket.
I want to start with one observation, because I'm very new, so I'm definitely a rooted feminist, and this is the first time that I've kind of started to think about these issues. I personally don't ever think about what it means to be a good woman. I think about what it means to be a good person, and about being kind or being patient or being a good friend. And so it's very interesting to me that there seems to be this need to think about being a good man, and I wondered if we can unpack that a bit more, and how we can incorporate being caring and caring for other people into positive masculinity. Because I feel a lot of my male friends say they're feminists, but if you try to raise with them an issue like, would they be the one who took 2-3 years off work to care for a child out of their career? No way. Absolutely not. Sorry, those were kind of complicated questions.
No, they're good questions, thank you. And the final person here, just behind you there.
Hello, sorry, very loud. It's lovely to hear your dignity and respect and dialogue and how human you are and how articulate and expressive you are. This is in very stark contrast to a debate, so-called debate, just before this involving somebody called Martin Daubney. I was absolutely horrified by his adversarial, generally aggressive demeanour. And I was very concerned that he's involved in the Being a Man festival. He dominated the whole proceedings, and it's such a shame. I really wish that you could have participated in that debate. It would have been wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'll just... Do you want to... Yes, okay, quickly, yes, sorry.
Sorry, I'll be really quick. I just wondered, I think you've talked a lot about men kind of stereotyping men, and you know, it's in that arena, men being very hard in validation. I wondered if you could sort of look at, are women contributing to those stereotypes? Are women looking for kind of these strong men? Are they taught to kind of, go into that
That's a very, very good point. Okay. I just want to unpack 2 or 3 things here. We've only got 4 minutes left. 2 minutes left. But the questions are good because you can go away and discuss the questions. First of all, on the issue of Martin Daubney, I think that I was at that session. Right? And I don't want to speak on behalf of anybody, but I think that Martin had a particular pressure because he'd introduced Katie Price, he'd brought Katie Price along, he was very concerned that Katie Price wasn't sort of put into a vulnerable position. And his style in that debate. Thank you, please. You have made the point, right? And I understand how you feel. But I'm only going to say that his involvement in Being a Man Festival was actually excellent, because he unlocked a huge amount about his investigation into online pornography and the implications of it and his battle against it. So if he took an adversarial and inappropriate, in your opinion, style this afternoon, then that was a pity. But don't damn him out of court for that. Being a good man, that's a kind of an interesting one, isn't it? Because, I think the issue of being a good man and a good woman as opposed to a good human, it obviously trails the idea that there is such a thing as an image of men. John?
I think of that quote, someone gave it to me once, Marcus Aurelius, one of the Roman guys, emperors, waste no time judging what a good man should be one. And I kind of like that, because you're always kind of looking and judging and stuff, and I think there are certain issues we grow up with, and this whole thing of the gentleman, opening the door and putting his coat down and all this sort of stuff, and obviously that's been blown out of the water in many ways, and I don't know. I don't always. I used to stand up on the tube. If there's a woman in front of me and I'd stand up. I don't do that now. Is that being a bad man? No, it's not. And of course, if someone's elderly or needs my seat, then I'll stand up. I think again, this whole thing of role models, which is another great debate. But I think there are men out there who are trying to, who are displaying good things.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bigger question which we'll have to come back to in the next festival. Both being, a good man and a good woman. But there's no doubt in just what you've just said, which is that if you take away some of the kind of things that we have been told make a good man, like opening a door, but you don't tell him say what it's going to be replaced with, it can make men feel, I've just fallen off this cliff and I'm embarrassed. Which can produce sort of a backlash, I think. I mean, the cultural, I'm just whipping through here, but the issue of, should you admire the Cypriot culture with its misogyny, or should you move on away from it? Move on away from it. Move on away from it.
Can I touch on that point just for 1 second, though? I agree with when it says you move on away from misogyny, but we shouldn't conflate progressive attitudes with Western attitudes. They're not the same thing. And that's to fail to understand history. Not a single country on earth was a democracy during the period that it was industrializing. Right? So all of these countries that have become rich by colonizing and brutalizing everyone else, and are now comfortable enough to say, we're very liberal. To fail to understand the history is to then say, well, they're not misogynistic. Have we supported I don't want to go into a rant about it, but have we supported the rulers of other parts of the world that have pushed for women's equality? Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, no. Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, etc. I could give you a whole list of leaders who had feminist leading, who wanted to support relative equality in their countries, who were murdered with the active connivance of our intelligence agencies. So we shouldn't conflate progressiveness with Westernness. As China becomes richer, as China becomes, those attitudes will change. Societies are not static. Does that make sense? So I think it's, we go with what's progressive and what's human, but that doesn't belong to one group of humanity.
Yeah. Now, okay. So we didn't pledge anything from Being a Man, because Being a Man isn't a standing committee and WOW isn't a standing committee. It's a place where you personally can have discourse and make individual decisions and form groups and become activists, etc., etc. And part of the point of the market in WOW and the market in BAM is to find out all the people who are already making progress and doing projects like Shawnee's and join them and support them. So that's the answer to that. But I hope that, I'm glad that you feel that the contribution, as you said this afternoon, from these guys who I have learned a lot from, and we continue to learn from each other. And I'd just like to thank you very much indeed for being a man.
Sorry, can I just want to say one thing. I read a really lovely quote this morning. It was by Cher. Just the gay man, the co-chair, and she said that women get excited over nothing and then they marry him. I thought that was brilliant.
That's a bit hard. Women get excited over nothing and then they marry him.
Well, I'm glad I didn't say that.
That's bad.
Wow.
That's too femme.
Wow.